All right, I think we're all here. Go ahead and get started. So let's establish positive motivation for our time, generating the minds of confidence in the Buddha's wisdom, the mind of recognizing that that confidence is based on refuge, seeing the Buddha and his teachings as unmistaken, non-deceptive, valid, powerful, and wanting to follow in the footsteps of the Buddha and accomplish enlightenment as he did, and as many other Buddhas before and after have done, in relying on the path, wanting to accomplish that result not for oneself, but to be of limitless benefit to sentient beings. These minds of faith and refuge and bodhicitta, you try to establish as the basis of our purpose. All right. So I wanted to start actually by going back a little bit. Well, going back in one way that's a little bit, maybe a little bit longer, and then going back in another way that's probably briefer. So if we revisit day 247, that I believe was the contemplation where we had a kind of a long discussion on wholesome desire and unwholesome desire. And we kind of settled on thinking of desire in the context that it was presented in terms of the delusion, as it's being presented as, a desire that is afflicted in its nature, that is directly linked to an afflicted mind. Um, and then later, when I was kind of thinking about that discussion and looking at some of the later points and some of the points in there, I got well, I feel like probably the word isn't used and it's not used in the same sort of formal context, but I feel like it could be in this context that what Lama Yeshe is meaning to get at is craving, or um, tana, craving. Well, in English, craving is one. Thirst is another English translation, um, and and so it's a really important concept in Buddhism. The idea of crave. Sometimes you might hear desire. I think I mentioned I used the phrase desirous attachment, um, or sometimes you hear desire and craving. So in that sense, I think desire is one way of also presenting craving, but craving or thirst as words that are getting at Tana, I think, are a little bit more common, um, to refer to that sort of technical mental factor of thirst. And it is different than attachment. So if you look at, we all know that attachment is a mind that apprehends an object that the mind views as being imbued with pleasant qualities, desirable qualities, and then subsequently clings. So craving and clinging, attachment, clinging is another way of really the word attachment, saying attachment. So it's holding on to, and feeling that one's happiness is dependent upon constant contact with pleasant objects, this sense of sticking to or clinging to or being unable to tolerate separation from things that seem desirable, that seem pleasant. But craving or thirst is more generalized, and it kind of sets the stage for clinging to arise because, like I said, clinging depends upon observing an object. And thirst or craving is kind of just, in a way, it's related to what Lama Zopa, always calls the mind of constant dissatisfaction. It's just sort of this wanting, that doesn't have an object yet. That isn't. It's you wake up in the morning and you begin to like want, whatever, and generally here in this context there's different baskets, and I really, we're just gonna, look at the one related to sensory, pleasure. All of the sensory pleasures is kind of one basket of thirst. So craving to hear pleasant sounds, to have pleasant, to touch things that are pleasant, or to be touched in ways that are pleasant, to see things that appear pleasant, to taste things, to smell things. And so that is something that occurs kind of just in a generalized way, sort of all of the time, irrespective of whether there are any objects of attachment. They kind of motivate us to seek out objects of attachment. And so it's there in the mind as sort of a precondition for attachment, this hunger, this thirst, this sort of craving, thinking that the present moment isn't satisfactory, doesn't contain the right kind of smells, the right kinds of foods, the right kinds of, touches and sights and so on. And then the dissatisfaction or the anxiety or tension that arises in the mind due to that disconnect of craving existing in the mind, thirst existing in the mind, and then the pleasure-seeking behavior of finding objects of attachment. So it becomes a little bit more, it becomes particularly, I think, relevant in the section that we're moving into, or that, which is kind of the second thing that I wanted to say. I should have signposted the last contemplation a bit better. It's a little bit confusing because some of the contemplations are numbered in terms of where they fall in this category and some aren't. But we started on Thursday, day 249, with the first of the 5 factors that stimulate the arising of afflictions. That was when we that quotation was: the fundamental cause of the deluded mind is the karmic imprint left on our consciousness by previous non-virtuous actions. So that is the first of the five, what they call, it's just one of these lists in Buddhism, the five factors that stimulate the arising of the afflictions. The first is the karmic imprints from the past. So I should have said, oh, hey, guess what? We've started the five factors that stimulate the arising of afflictions when we cover day 249, because the other factors are now what are coming. The next four contemplations are the other of the five factors that stimulate the arising of the afflictions. So just helpful to know that that's kind of the mini sort of section where we are right now. Okay, is there anything else that I wanted to say about craving or thirst? I don't think so. Um, any questions about what I just said, or last week, previous class?
Mhm. I was going to ask, just because I picked up one of the books you recommended, and I'm just at the very beginning reading about the importance of understanding self-cherishing. And so it's sort of been like something just to kind of watch in the background for the day. Because I just started on that. How does that relate to exactly what we're moving into, like karmic imprint, or how we're moving into craving?
Mm-hmm. So conceptually, I mean, in terms of this list of these factors, it's not also going to be presented on the list of the five factors. These are largely, the five factors are largely influences, um, except for I mean, the other four are like sort of largely, well, then there's also habit. So some of them um, are parts of the mind, and some of them are like circumstantial or environmental. Um, so we'll see, we'll make sense of the list of five. But so self grasping and self cherishing, they're very early in the causal chain of affliction. Like we said, you've got, because fundamental ignorance exists in the mind, self grasping occurs, and then on the basis of self-grasping, self-cherishing occurs. And that is certainly a primary factor in the arising of all of the deluded states, because we're starting from a position of going through life in a very self-centered way, in a very kind of myopic way, where the things that I think, you know, that are important, they are critically important. The things that I think are silly are, it's sort of intrinsically useless and pointless. And the things that happen to me are, what I care most about. The things that happen to other people, I care, maybe, and people are in different points, with that, but certainly very few people um, care more about what happens to other people than as compared to oneself. Only bodhisattvas, probably are successful in really truly reversing that. Um, so because that is sort of a fundamental state that we find ourselves in, the delusions arise very easily in that kind of mind, the kind of mind that, and it's not to say that that's, I mean, it's problematic in terms of as something that is holding us back from enlightenment, but we share it in common with every other sentient being. So it isn't unusual or, monstrous. It's just um, a baseline that all ordinary sentient beings kind of share, this idea that I have to just look out mainly for myself, and that um, what happens to me is really important, and what happens to other people is potentially important, but not when it conflicts with what I would prefer. And we can make progress, of course, like we said in I think the one before, we can use our wisdom, we can overcome, we can see through these mistaken ways of thinking. But still, there are very strong karmic imprints that we have from beginningless past lives of, because every time that we've been, taken rebirth in an animal body and so on, it gets reinforced in ways that, so there's just a lot of conditioning that our wisdom has to overcome, because only sometimes do we have the ability, if you look at every incarnation that our mind has ever experienced, it's only every once in a while when we're really in a position to use that wisdom. Most of the time, we're in the lower realms, or we're in, sometimes, not very often, but occasionally in the upper realms. And, we don't even have the capacity. And then even when we're in a human realm, is it do we really have all of the factors, is there teachings? Do we have the leisure and the opportunity to study the teachings? So there's a lot of momentum to overcome with that. So it definitely is, we're starting from a mind that is one in which afflictions pretty easily get sparked, because of self-grasping and self-cherishing. Any other questions? Okay, so we covered day 249, which is the idea that we do have these imprints because we've met with conditions again and again and again. Day 250, the quotation is, we project our fantasy onto objects and finish up miserable and dissatisfied. So here, this is the second factor, and this is contact with the object, the actual object of the affliction. So he says a good example is when we go shopping. The object is there on the shelf. Through the sense perception of our eye, we come into contact with it, and before we are aware of what is happening, our mind sinks with attachment into the object. It can happen in a very sneaky way, and it can be extremely difficult to separate our mind from this desired object. So, so this is getting at different ways of thinking, in a way, about renunciation. There's ways in which we need to develop more introspective awareness about our relationship to objects. And an object here just means that which can be cognized. So it doesn't, as we've said before, in Buddhism, object doesn't, never means inanimate. By definition, it encompasses any kind of cognizable phenomena. So it could be, that, power, a person might, power might be an object that a person really craves, being in control, being able to give orders and be followed, and that kind of adulation or fear, or that could be an object for that person, even though it's not, it's sort of a social status or situation. But still, they might, if they know that about themselves, then they need to maybe be particularly careful. And that's kind of what I'm meaning here, is that different people are going to get triggered by different kinds of objects, different kinds of, they're going to get pulled on or sucked into, with the mind of attachment, different things. Another person might have no interest in power or, authority. And so, they might get nominated for something or asked to do something, and maybe they do it, but their mind never goes into, thinking about, well, people have to listen to me, they have to do what I say. That's great. I really get excited by that sort of. And so same situation, same object, but people's kind of tendencies, their habits, their predispositions are different. And for some people, they may have, kind of, to one degree or another, bona fide, almost addictive, relationships with, could be food, could be alcohol, different things. And so for that person, again, what's key is the introspective awareness of recognizing, okay, well, on what level do I need to practice renunciation with respect to this object? Because renunciation is turning away from suffering, right? Choosing to definitely emerge from suffering. And we can see that if we struggle with certain kinds of objects, then they are a source of, even though it may not look like suffering, because if we can, like with food or, with power, could be that, it isn't necessarily going to shorten our life. It isn't necessarily, it could, some people with food addiction, it really does, like, they don't live as long because they just can't get a handle on it. But other people, it's more moderate, and it's just, maybe they're a bit overweight, or, their health isn't as good as it, but probably they live a normal time, but still, or maybe they stayed in power their whole life, and, maybe it harmed other people. And that's really the kind of the point, is that there could be these subtle, karmic issues, or, things that need to be paid attention to, that don't seem as, manifest in a way. Like, your doctor wouldn't necessarily say something, a therapist wouldn't necessarily say something, but you're practicing a habit that's not leading you to, to happiness. It's kind of keeping you stuck in, even just chasing objects of attachment, even just kind of, wasting your time, and not having time and space and energy to devote yourself, or to have, time for practice, because of filling your time with objects of attachment. So in one way of thinking about the coarser level of renunciation is kind of the way, because in Mahayana tradition, renunciation is presented, in a way, in a subtler way than you often find it talked about in the Theravada tradition, because, there's sort of, in the Mahayana tradition, there's these more advanced techniques for transforming experiences, and you don't really find those teachings as much, in Theravada. So in Theravada, they do kind of emphasize, thinking about that, getting stuck as kind of, well, just avoid, just, at least, for long periods of time, and of course, in some, like with monasticism and celibacy, that's a lot, it isn't like, well, at some point you go into something else. Like, that's a lifelong thing. It doesn't become something else, that's, just maybe one example, but it's one example where, the kind of consequences, are just something, well, it's just sort of better to just never, go down that route. Um, but and so even for us, we, at least for a time, might think about, are there things um, where I do need to relate to certain objects with that kind of distance, or to create more kind of physical distance, to not, um, and of course, addiction specialists and things, they would kind of give the same advice in some circumstances. Like if a person's genuinely an alcoholic, well, your doctor wouldn't say, well, sure, keep going to the bar, keep putting yourself in those situations where alcohol is everywhere and everyone else around you is doing it. They would say, for a long time, and maybe for the rest of your life, maybe don't do that. Maybe stay away from those places, because you'll fall into that pattern. Could be that after some time, and this is, and Buddhism would say that we're all, Venerable Rabina says we're all junkies, we're all, maybe the objects are not, again, maybe they're not going to shorten our lives, but they're still, we engage in problematic, attachments with things. So might be that we do need to think about creating distance, creating separation. Um, at least until, our practice is stronger, we have more tools, more ability, and so on. Any thoughts? Or
Venerable, could you explain or define the word superstition? It's just about at the end of that section about deluded mind coming into contact with desirable objects leads to superstition.
I think on day 250. Is that day 250?
Correct. It says it's just the last paragraph about just about at the end, before he's talking about Milarepa.
I think we're not on the same. I don't think that's 250.
Oh, okay. I've got 250, and I'll just read it. It says,
What's the quotation for that contemplation?
we project our fantasy onto
I
objects and finish up miserable and dissatisfied.
don't know why I'm not seeing it.
He writes, the deluded mind coming into contact with desirable objects leads to superstition, producing more and more delusion.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry. I don't know why I couldn't see that. So I mean, in a way, I think it's another just kind of colloquial way that Lama Yeshe talked. That because he just has his own way of talking about things. My my sense is that it's just talking about the layer of projection that um, fundamental ignorance, just um, we when we see an object of attachment or aversion, we relate to it really only through the lens of attachment or aversion, which isn't something that is a valid part of the object. Um, it's there's sensory data there. There's you know shape and color and texture and what have you. So there's base sensory data there, but our understanding of it as pleasurable or aversive is purely a fiction of the mind that flows from fundamental ignorance. So I think that and that's kind of that way of relating is really persistent over time. The kinds of desserts and things that we seek out, they're usually, there's 5 or 8 of them, and there's other things that we don't, that we never kind of do, and the kinds of things that we buy, could be, some people, it's cars for some people, for other people, they collect whatever, or they, and so if you're a car person, or then that's your object. And the more and so you never really have that realistic view of whatever it is that's triggering your attachment. You just, it's just this neediness to possess the object. And if we never pierce that veil, if we never kind of apply a wisdom mind, then it's just going to reinforce. It's just going to become a cycle of these objects of attachment feeding the delusion of seeing them in a mistaken way. So I think attachment or superstition is probably really just the same as like the mistaken view that we have of objects on the basis of fundamental ignorance. And the kind of then all of the habits and because then we think, oh, well, that will make me happy. The more of these objects I can get, which is Lama Yeshe would say, well, that's a superstitious whole way of thinking and perceiving, is just getting more of these objects of attachment and just being separated from objects of aversion, that works, is kind of a delusory scheme that we come up with also. And then we spend our whole life just feeding into that false narrative.
Thank you.
So yeah, so the takeaway is that, it could be that if we don't feel right now that we can be in relation to a particular object without the delusions arising, then maybe we should wait until our practice is stronger. And then, like I say, I mean, there are techniques in the Mahayana tradition for transforming objects of attachment into the path and so on. And so it isn't necessarily to say that we'll never be prepared to relate, but maybe it's better to create distance when we're beginners on the path. Okay, any other thoughts or questions? So with day 251, this is kind of what Felice was saying the other day about our social circle, about the friends that we keep. So here he says negative, misleading friends who give us diluted information are make us confused. He says, therefore, whom we have for friends, with whom we stay in close contact, is very important. So there's actually, a vow, and of course, as we said when this came up before, that it doesn't mean that we, fully abandon people, and we may make other suggestions if it's sort of that they're encouraging us to put ourselves into situations that we prefer not to. Then we say, well, I really value our time together. How about instead of that, you come over and we have tea, or we have lunch together at my place, where we cut out those problematic things, because I want to be your friend, but I just don't, these some things are not good for me, and then if they say, well, forget you, then that's their problem, and they've decided that they don't want to have that healthier dynamic. um, but and there's actually a vow in uh, the lay vows, to not to be careful about coming under the influence of people who are taking us away from what we are trying to do. Uh, so yeah, he says it's essential to always remain compassionate. We should also remember that we are here. He says polluted already, but that's a heavy way of just saying that we are under the influence of afflicted states of mind, and so we can't blame the people who are maybe encouraging things that are not the best for us, because if we were a bodhisattva, if we could be we could be doing those things and they wouldn't disturb our mind at all. It's just because our mind is presently so under the influence of these afflicted states that for our benefit, we have to hold ourselves back from some things. But our friends, those people, and, he mentions, could be people in society, not necessarily, but people we might listen to, like, people that are writing books or giving lectures, and we might fall into certain ways of thinking that could be problematic. None of those people gave us the afflicted mind that we have. It's just if we've made the decision to overcome the afflicted mind that only we are responsible for, then it isn't helpful to indulge or engage in certain ways that are going to just feed into that affliction. So it isn't like, oh, you're a terrible person, I need to stay away from you. It's like my mind is fragile and I don't have the space to be in that situation right now, and so I'm choosing to protect my own mind by shifting things and doing things in a different way. Okay. Well, day 252. This is uh, in the commentary. It says following false teachings. In some places, they'll talk about again, like, where are we getting information from? Like, what media are we consuming? Um, what what kind of social influences are we listening to? Are we giving credence to? And it could also just be not necessarily, because here he says, so I think the worst is kind of following, someone who says, well, salvation, um, is found by doing something that's objectively harmful, or that would probably be the worst thing in terms of what kinds of external sources of information we're following. But really just getting wrapped up in societal messages about how important wealth is and status is, and power, and and just the consumerist sort of attitude that's so pervasive in society, thinking that that is what we should adopt for ourselves is, because then that's going to feed into the mind of dissatisfaction, that's going to feed our attachments, and we're going to just continue to be stuck. So there's different, this is kind of a little bit in a broader way, thinking about what messages, what information are we bringing in, from outside of ourselves, and who, you know, who are we listening to? What are we giving credence to, in terms of external sources of information? And then the last is, again, as I mentioned, habit, is the last of the fifth of the five, the fifth of the five factors, the last of the five factors that stimulate the arising of afflictions, which is related to karmic imprint, because we've said, if we go back to karma, and one of the ways that karma ripens is it ripens as the impulse to engage in the action again. And that's true for positive and negative karmic seeds. If we build up a lot of positive mental, positive karmic potentials, karmic seeds in the mind, then we're priming ourselves to be attracted to positive, constructive actions. If we engage in, if there's a propensity of negative karmic seeds in the mind, then we're going to slip into more and more easily continuing non-virtuous actions. And then the actual process of doing that is the habit. So we may have a karmic propensity, we may have a karmic impulse, but still, again, using our wisdom, we do have control. Increasingly over time, we gain more and more control over, using introspective awareness, noticing these impulses, these habits. They don't, the impulse becomes a habit when it's actually engaged in over and over again. We can't do anything about however many times in however many previous lives we've engaged in that problematic behavior. And that could be generating an impulse that is present in this life. But more and more as we develop, we do have increasing levels of control over the actual habits that we're furthering in this life. And whether we wear that groove into the mind deeper and deeper, or whether we go, in a different direction and we establish a new habit, we establish a more constructive, antidotal kind of habit. But the more that we do engage in a delusory habit, the easier it's going to become to engage in it. Any thoughts or questions about the 5 factors that stimulate the arising of afflictions? So like I said, it's a little strange. The last, he says 3, 4, and 5, in that list, but 1 and 2, they're there, but they're not listed as 1 and 2. And he starts with 3. It's a little strange, but they're all there. Any thoughts, questions?
Yeah. When you speak to habits and the kind of establishing grooves or disestablishing and establishing something different, it's for me reminds me of the concept of neural pathways. Like the way that we fire, we continue to fire until we literally work to change that. It sounds very much alike.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I in one way, I think Buddhism can be understood as a really comprehensive cognitive psychology in many ways. Um, so, yeah, I think that, and I mean, it could be that there's no, uh, that it makes sense, in a way that the mind and the brain, that, because the body and so on um, is a manifestation of karma, and so maybe that it's reasonable that the kind of body that we've manifested through, well, I don't know, I mean, karmic manifestation. I just don't want to make it sound like a new age kind of a thing, but karmic is a term, but that that there really could be that kind of relationship might make sense, because that's also how the mind works in the same way, and so the brain and the mind are different things, but they are intimately related, and so yeah, it could be that they're that maybe they're feeding, that the way that the mind works and the way that the brain works are kind of feeding back, into each other in that way. Okay. The last thing that we'll cover then is day 254. Our internal world is constantly being thrown out of balance by the two extremes of attachment and hatred. So this is just kind of a summary in a way of the things that we've talked about before, recognizing that attachment requires an overestimation of what we're observing. It's good, he says, its good aspects are emphasized so much that we lose all judgment about it, all perspective. We think that pleasant objects are made out of pleasantness, made out of happiness. We don't see that they also have disadvantageous qualities. We don't see them in a realistic or holistic way. We just see the one aspect of it that's appearing to the mind as desirable. And simultaneously, we view the object as if it were somehow self-existent. We conceive of it, he says, as something permanent, existing self-sufficiently in the way that it appears to us. We fail to see that the way it appears is a function of our projections. Instead, he says, we think these exaggerated qualities come from the object itself, rather than being what we have projected onto the object from our own side. And then he talks about how, that this is a very myopic, again, very self-centered, myopic view that, he gives the example of kind of falling in love in the conventional sense, not in the Buddhist sense. Love in the Buddhist sense is wishing for a particular sentient being or all sentient beings to have happiness and the causes of happiness. Whereas love in the kind of colloquial sense is in a way indistinguishable from attachment. It's sort of, this pleases me. I enjoy being around this person or this situation. When we say I love so and so, a lot of times it's very similar to saying I love chocolate cake. There's not necessarily always a huge distinction between those two ways of using the word, which is to say chocolate cake is something that pleases me. I enjoy it. I want, and because it pleases me, I want to be around it. I want to have it in my environment. But if that other person starts to act in a different way, if they change their belief system, or um, they grow in a particular way and they become interested in different things, then he says we start, our attitude will start to change. We will start to reject that person and think of them as repulsive and think of them as aversive, because they no longer please us. They're no longer a pleasant stimulus. And we see that with marriages and things all of the time. People, when they get married, they're blissful, and they say, well, we'll be together forever. We will, until the day that we die. And then over these years, you know, again, they grow in different ways. Their habits change, their interests change. They get, maybe to some degree, it's not as new or as interesting as it was. And so we get kind of bored because it was that sort of infatuation more so than actual care and affection. And then these really awful, nasty divorces, where there's recrimination and lawsuits and, dragging people through the mud. And all of that is the flip side of where that relationship was based on um, the deluded, kind of exaggerated mind. Uh, so he says it's only the deluded mind that seems, well, here he says obsessed, the obsessed mind that sees things in terms of black and white. So only when we're strongly under the influence of the delusion of attachment or the delusion of aversion does that person, that same person that appeared to the mind to be angelic and perfect, then they appear to the mind to be demonic and horrible. And same person, maybe they changed in some ways, but they're pretty much the same person. But our relation to them is just, in both cases, completely blown out of proportion, completely deluded, completely unrealistic, because either the mind of attachment was operating or the mind of aversion was operating. And we saw them in these completely cartoonish, in a ways as compared to what a more realistic mind would have seen. And we do this, all of the time. This ping-ponging, as we've, said, between objects of attachment and objects of aversion. Okay, any thoughts or questions from today? Nope. All right, so we'll leave it there for today. Today is Monday, so we will pick things back up on Thursday. Okay, so let's end with dedication. So we recollect our altruistic motivation and think that by having listened and participated, we've actualized that intention, which has generated positive energy in the mind. That positive energy will ripen in beneficial, supportive ways in the future. And we want it to particularly ripen in ways that support our spiritual growth and development. So bring to mind all of the ways in which you would like to offer your practice as causes for beneficial, constructive, spiritual goals and intentions. All right. So, yeah. Yeah, so Geshe Sherab is starting a new class on Sunday on the 12 links. That's also coming up here in a bit. So that'll be really good. That's also related to this whole idea of the evolution of samsara. So that's definitely all part of the same topic. Okay, well, have a good evening.